I didn't need to run a secondary macro to verify the discrepancy, but I executed the automated script anyway, watching the lines of bright green code cascade down the matte surface of my left monitor. The heavy coastal fog rolling off the Pacific Ocean was pressing relentlessly against the tall, arched front windows of Salt and Spine books, casting a muted, diffused gray light across my temporary, makeshift workstation. The ambient scent of the room was a complex, heavy matrix of decomposing lignin from old paper, deteriorating organic binding glue, roasting espresso from the corner machine, and the sharp, metallic tang of cold sea salt. It was a fundamentally chaotic environment. Hardcover books were stacked haphazardly on rolling metal carts. Mismatched velvet reading chairs were scattered without any discernible geometric logic, and the aged oak floorboards creaked with an unpredictable, arrhythmic pattern every single time a customer walked past the history section. My silver fountain pen paused midair. The numbers on the illuminated spreadsheet stayed perfectly still, but my jaw tightened hard enough to cause a dull ache at the base of my skull. Rigged equations felt like a physical abrasion against my skin, a violation of the only universal language that actually made sense to me. I tapped the screen with the solid brass cap of my pen, isolating the specific data row. The depreciation schedule for the vintage printing press, located in the back storage room, claimed a sudden, catastrophic value drop of exactly 40% over a single fiscal quarter. I had personally inspected that press exactly 22 minutes ago. It was a flawlessly maintained 1950s Heidelberg windmill press, its heavy cast-iron gears meticulously oiled, its rubber ink rollers pristine and fully operational. Machinery of that specific historical caliber and mechanical condition appreciated in value on the secondary collector's market. It did not rapidly depreciate. Someone was intentionally, artificially suppressing the core asset value of the business on the digital ledger to force a technical default on the commercial operating loan. I checked the digital timestamp embedded deep within the hidden metadata of the entry. October 14th, 2:14 a.m. The systematic modification was logged directly under the secure administrative ID of the former co-owner. A sharp brass bell mounted above the front door chimed, slicing cleanly through the quiet, steady hum of my laptop's dual cooling fans and the low, relentless murmur of the coastal rain. I looked up from my dual screens. She walked in, carrying a soaked, heavy, corrugated cardboard box of incoming inventory against her chest. Her dark hair was pinned up loosely with a carved wooden stylus, catching the damp coastal mist and curling slightly at her temples. She wore a thick, heavy-knit fisherman's sweater, the sleeves pushed aggressively up to her elbows, revealing forearms corded with the visible physical strain of carrying dead weight from the loading dock through the storm. She set the wet box down on the main polished mahogany counter with a heavy, definitive thud that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the nearby acrylic display stands. This was Gia Turner, 38 years old, the sole remaining operator and managing director of the bookstore after her former partner bought out half the equity and vanished into a vague consulting role, leaving her holding the entire operational and financial framework of a massive, independent business. Laura Morales, the store manager, rushed out from the back office, clutching a stack of thick manila envelopes against her gray cardigan. Laura's hands were visibly shaking, the sharp edges of the paper vibrating against the wool fabric. Gia. It arrived. The private courier just dropped it off at the back alley entrance, Laura said, her voice dropping into a breathless, panicked register that echoed slightly in the quiet, empty sections of the shop. Gia stood motionless behind the heavy mahogany counter. She wiped the rainwater from her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a faint streak of cardboard dust across her pale skin. She didn't look at Laura's panicked face. She kept her eyes locked entirely on the thick envelope. Open it, Laura. Read the legal header aloud. Laura tore the glued flap with a jagged, uncoordinated motion. She pulled out a thick sheaf of heavy, stock legal paper. Her eyes scanned the bold text at the top, widening in absolute horror. It's from Bo's attorneys? It's a formal notice of default. They're claiming the store missed the quarterly collateral covenant metric by 12%. They are officially calling the $45,000 mezzanine note due immediately. Date of execution is the 30th of this month. Gia's shoulders went entirely rigid. She closed her eyes, maintaining absolute, disciplined stillness for exactly 2 seconds. When she opened them, the raw exhaustion I had observed earlier was carefully locked away behind a formidable wall of absolute, unyielding grit. She adjusted her posture, straightening her spine against the invisible weight pressing down on her. We didn't miss the metric, Gia stated, her voice projecting a forced, steady calm that completely contradicted the white-knuckle grip of her hands on the edge of the wooden counter. We hit net positive cash flow on Tuesday afternoon immediately after the university textbook order cleared the merchant account. The legal paper says otherwise, Laura whispered, her voice tightening into a tight knot of fear. If we don't pay the full $45,000 by the 30th, the bank physically seizes the building. Bo gets it in the liquidation auction for pennies on the dollar. I sat in my ergonomic chair in the history section, silently observing the raw data points of the human crisis unfolding exactly 20 feet away. My forensic accounting firm had been hired directly by the regional bank to conduct a routine, third-party risk audit of their commercial loan portfolio. I was supposed to be an absolute ghost in this localized ecosystem. A neutral, detached observer who verified the arithmetic, submitted a secure PDF to the underwriting department, and moved on to the next file without ever leaving a footprint. Laura's hands kept shaking. The timestamp on Bo's digital edit didn't. One of them was blind panic. One of them was immutable proof. I stood up, pushing my chair back with a deliberate, audible scrape against the floorboards. I closed my laptop screen precisely halfway, ensuring the sleep protocol engaged and secured my encrypted data. I picked up my printed sheet detailing the D44 cell anomaly and walked down the narrow, dimly lit aisle. My footsteps measured, heavy, and quiet against the oak floor. "You didn't miss the metric," I said, my voice carrying clearly and flatly across the room. Both women snapped their heads toward my direction. Gia's expression instantly tightened into a severe, impenetrable defensive guard. Her eyes narrowed, assessing the immediate threat level I represented. "Mr. Thomas, I thought you were sequestered in the back reading area conducting your bank review?" "I am," I replied, keeping my vocal tone entirely level, meticulously stripped of any emotional inflection, aggression, or pity. I stopped exactly 3 feet from the edge of the mahogany counter, maintaining a respectful, non-threatening physical proximity. "And my structural review indicates that your former partner, Bo Cox, manually altered the depreciation schedule of your physical printing assets at 2 in the morning, exactly 3 weeks ago. He artificially suppressed your overall collateral value on the ledger to force a technical trigger of the covenant breach." Gia stared at me. Her dark eyes darted from my impassive face to the legal papers trembling in Laura's hands, processing the new variable with rapid, clinical speed. She didn't break down into tears. She didn't ask why he would do this. She asked the only practical question that mattered in a tactical financial environment. "Can you prove it on paper?" "I am a forensic accountant." "Miss Turner," I stated, sliding the crisp, white printout smoothly across the polished surface of the counter so it stopped exactly in front of her resting hands. "I don't deal in theories, assumptions, or workplace politics. I deal in server timestamps, IP routing logs, and unalterable system architecture. I have the exact terminal MAC address he used to log into the cloud ledger. The default notice you are holding is fundamentally fraudulent." Gia looked down at the paper. Her eyes scanned the highlighted yellow lines, tracking the numeric discrepancies I had isolated. The tension in her jaw shifted, the muscles grinding slightly before releasing into a tight, focused line. "The bank won't care about a single printout from an auditor. Bo sits on their regional advisory board. He plays golf with the senior underwriters. They will execute the asset freeze on his word alone. A commercial litigator would take 3 weeks just to draft the preliminary discovery motions," I pointed out, laying the logistical reality on the table. "The bank's covenant clock is measured in days, and Bo controls their first impression. By the time a lawyer files an injunction, the bank locks the doors." She looked up at me, the defensive wall lowering by a fraction of an inch, replaced by intense, calculating scrutiny. "Why are you stepping in? Your firm is paid by the exact same executives he plays golf with." "I work for the math," I said simply, holding her gaze without blinking. "However, to construct a legally binding defense that overrides his board influence, I require 3 weeks of unredacted, physical access to your vendor invoices, your secondary handwritten ledgers, and the original, ink-signed incorporation documents. If you provide them to me, I will systematically dismantle his claim before the deadline." Gia measured me. She analyzed my rigid posture, my tailored charcoal suit, my absolute neutrality. She didn't look for warmth or sympathy. She looked for rigorous competence. She tapped her index finger against the printout twice, a sharp, decisive sound against the wood. "Laura, go lock the front deadbolt. Flip the open sign to closed," Gia instructed. her voice dropping into a register of absolute, unquestionable command. She turned her attention back to me, her eyes locking onto mine. Mr. Thomas, follow me to the basement archive. The basement of Salt and Spine was a logistical nightmare that assaulted my senses immediately upon descending the creaking wooden stairs. It was a vast, windowless, cavern-lined, floor-to-ceiling, with heavy, industrial metal shelving. The sprawling space was filled with 10 years of cardboard banker's boxes, stacked indiscriminately without regard for weight distribution, temporal order, or vendor categories. The air down here was bone dry, smelling intensely of decomposing cardboard dust, oxidized printer ink, and damp concrete. It lacked any coherent alphanumeric or chronological filing system. To a precision addict like myself, it was a physical, tangible manifestation of utter chaos. I stood at the bottom of the wooden stairs, carefully adjusting the silver cufflinks of my dress shirt to maintain a sense of order. This is highly inefficient. The retrieval time for a single historical invoice in this specific environment is statistically unacceptable. We sell books, roads. We don't curate pristine tax museums, Gia said, hauling the first heavy, dust-covered box off the bottom shelf with a sharp grunt of effort. She dropped it heavily onto a long, scratched plastic folding table in the center of the room. A thick, gray cloud of dust plumed violently into the stagnant air, catching the harsh glare of the overhead fluorescent light. Data without a structured architecture is just noise, I replied, stepping forward to carefully open the folded cardboard lid, avoiding tearing the degraded material. For the next 4 hours, we established a rigid, unyielding workflow. I refused to let her hand me files haphazardly. I required them sorted by fiscal quarter, then subdivided by vendor ID, then strictly categorized by payment method. At first, the structural friction between our methodologies was palpable, sparking openly in the quiet room. Just look at the 2023 Q2 file. It proves he withdrew the cash for his personal expenses, she argued, holding up a bulging manila folder, her frustration evident in the tight, white-knuckled grip of her fingers on the paper. I didn't take it from her hand. I pointed firmly to the designated, perfectly squared pile on the left side of my laptop. Chain of custody. Gia. If I don't document the exact chronological sequence of the withdrawal against the centralized clearinghouse statement, Bo's corporate lawyers will dismiss it as an administrative clerical error during preliminary discovery, put it in the Q2 pile. We process it in order. She let out a sharp, heavy breath, the sound echoing slightly against the bare concrete walls, but she placed the folder exactly where I pointed, meticulously aligning its edges with the stack beneath it. She was a localized force of nature. She operated on deep passion, institutional memory, and operational instinct. I operated on rigid grids, immutable laws, and unyielding mathematical formulas. The friction between us was constant, but it was incredibly productive. She knew the complex human narrative of the business. I built the skeletal structure of unassailable facts required to support it in a hostile boardroom. Around 9 p.m., the deep silence in the basement archive was broken only by the rapid, rhythmic clicking of my mechanical 10-key adding machine. I was running a physical paper tape to verify a digital spreadsheet, trusting the tactile feedback of the mechanical keys over the automated software. I glanced up from my screen. Gia was sitting on a small metal step stool in the corner, leaning her head back against the cold steel of the shelving unit. Her eyes were squeezed tightly shut. She was rubbing the space between her eyebrows with a slow, heavy, circular motion using her thumb and forefinger. It was a primary physiological indicator of a severe tension headache. I stopped typing. I looked at the harsh, flickering fluorescent tube light directly above her head. The magnetic ballast was failing, emitting a high-frequency electronic hum and casting a microscopic, irritating strobe effect across her tired face. I stood up, pushing my chair back with a soft scrape against the concrete. I walked across the floor to the gray metal utility panel mounted on the far wall. I unlatched the heavy metal cover, located the faded paper schematic taped to the inside door, and firmly flipped the black breaker switch for Zone 3. The harsh, humming light above her snapped off instantly. The basement was plunged into a softer, ambient dimness, illuminated only by the remaining, stable light banks on the opposite side of the room. Gia opened her eyes. She looked at the dead, silent bulb above her, then looked across the room at me, her expression registering genuine surprise at the sudden quiet. The magnetic ballast was failing, I stated, walking back to my laptop and meticulously checking the alignment of my documents on the plastic table. It alters the visual refresh rate of the light spectrum. It causes ocular strain and migraines. We have sufficient ambient illumination from the secondary bank to continue reading. She lowered her hand from her face slowly. She didn't offer a dramatic thank you, but the tight, strained lines around her mouth and eyes relaxed by a visible, measurable fraction. You notice everything, don't you? I notice environmental anomalies, I said, sitting back down and aligning my notebook perfectly parallel to the edge of the folding table. You were wincing at a specific, repeating interval, synchronized with the auditory hum. It was a variable that required immediate correction to maintain productivity. She watched me for a long, quiet moment. The defensive tension in the room dissipated, replaced by a steady, working calm. She stood up, walked over to the insulated thermos she had brought down earlier, and poured a cup of steaming Earl Grey tea. She walked over to my workstation and set it down precisely 2 inches to the right of my mousepad, exactly outside the designated spill zone of my critical paperwork. Caffeine variable, she said softly, her voice holding a note of quiet, profound respect. Corrected. I looked at the steam rising from the ceramic cup, smelling the bright bergamot cutting sharply through the stale dust. I reached out and took the handle. Thank you. We worked in unbroken concentration until 1 a.m. By the time I packed my briefcase to leave the store, I had successfully isolated 3 separate, hidden shell accounts Bo Cox had established to artificially inflate the store's operating expenses. The defensive shield was slowly being forged in the dark. The rhythm held steady, but the pressure mounted. The days bled into a routine of forensic extraction. My peripheral vision logged the exact angle she turned the heavy brass deadbolt, always at 7:14 a.m. I registered the sharp scent of dark roast coffee on standard shipping days and the floral notes of steeped green tea when the freight logs showed vendor delays. I observed her defuse hostile customers with steady, unyielding boundaries, never raising her voice, but never retreating an inch. The fragile equilibrium broke early. It was a Thursday afternoon, exactly 4 days before the end of the month. I was auditing the Q2 tax remittance logs when Laura burst out of the back office, nearly colliding with a heavy display table. The cordless phone in her hand was shaking violently. Gia. The payroll didn't clear the bank? Laura gasped, her voice shrill and terrified. Gia stopped unboxing a heavy shipment of hardcovers. She carefully placed her box cutter on the counter, the metal blade retracting with a sharp, echoing snap. What do you mean it didn't clear? The funds transferred automatically from the operating account yesterday afternoon? The bank rejected the entire batch file, Laura said, her voice rising in pitch, teetering dangerously on the edge of panic. I just checked the online portal. The main operating account is locked. The balance is showing as 0. The banner says, Administrative Hold. Pending Default Arbitration. Gia froze. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her skin pale against the dark wool of her sweater. I stood up immediately. I walked deliberately behind the counter, bypassing Laura, and pulled my encrypted laptop from my leather satchel. I opened my secure banking terminal and bypassed the standard front-end user interface, directly accessing the back-end ledger data for the commercial branch. He triggered the freeze early, I said, my voice clipped and rapid as my eyes scanned the raw data strings. Bo didn't wait for the 30th of the month. He used his advisory board status to file a preliminary injunction claiming imminent capital flight. He formally told the underwriters, "You were moving liquid cash offshore to avoid the debt collection." "I have to pay my staff today," Gia whispered. It was the first time I had heard her sound truly, deeply terrified. It wasn't about the physical building anymore. It was about the people relying on her for their survival. Laura's rent is due tomorrow. The part-time students. I can't bounce their paychecks. I can't do that to them. She turned away, gripping the edge of the oak counter so hard her knuckles turned stark white. She was calculating the immediate cost of surrender. I could see the exact, devastating moment the math in her head told her the fight was over. "I'll call his attorneys," she said, her voice hollow and defeated. "I'll sign over the remaining equity. If I give him the building free and clear today, he'll release the payroll hold." "No," I said. It was a hard, flat command that echoed sharply in the quiet store. She turned back to me, her eyes blazing with a sudden, desperate anger. "Don't tell me no, Rhodes. You deal in spreadsheets and abstract numbers. I deal in people. I am not letting my staff go hungry so we can win a paperwork war next week in a boardroom. You are not calling his attorneys, I repeated, closing the physical distance between us. I didn't touch her. I didn't need to. I occupied the space with absolute, unyielding certainty. If you surrender the equity now, you legally validate his fraud. You lose the store, and he still liquidates the staff. The moment the ink dries. Then how do I pay them today? She demanded, stepping into my space, challenging my logic with the raw reality of the crisis. I looked her directly in the eye, holding her frantic gaze. You forced the bank to pay them. Gia stopped. The anger faltered, replaced by total confusion. What? I turned back to my laptop, my fingers flying across the keys. I opened my firm's direct compliance portal. I filed an emergency compliance escalation through the bank's official whistleblower portal, time-stamped and discoverable. I stated, my fingers striking the keyboard with heavy, rapid precision. I attached the server IP logs, the forged depreciation schedules, and the unauthorized shell account routing numbers. It routes directly to Elias Vance, the Chief Compliance Officer. I hit the Enter key, attaching the secure PDF files. If Vance ignores a formally documented fraud alert involving an advisory board member, it puts the bank on a discoverable record, I continued, never taking my eyes off the screen. If they ignore it, they expose themselves to intense federal scrutiny and massive civil liability. They will unlock the accounts before the close of business today to protect their own charter. Your staff will be paid with your own capital, legally, with a full chain of custody. I hit submit. The screen flashed a bright, solid green. Compliance, escalation, filed, tracking, ID, 884, Vance. I closed the laptop with a sharp click. I looked at her. You do not surrender to a lie. We finish the audit. We break his leverage completely at the arbitration meeting. Gia stared at me. The heavy, defensive wall she had built up over years of fighting alone cracked down the middle. She took a slow, deep, shuddering breath, and the paralyzing panic completely left her body. We waited in agonizing silence for 45 minutes. Then, my secure email client chimed loudly in the quiet store. I opened the message. It was from Elias Vance. Escalation received. Evidence under review. Administrative hold lifted pending internal investigation. Gia reached over to the terminal, watching the screen as Laura's phone buzzed simultaneously with an automated alert. The batch cleared, Laura gasped, staring at her screen, tears springing to her eyes. Gia closed her eyes, exhaling a long, shuddering breath. She opened them and locked her gaze onto mine. Okay, she said softly, the formidable strength returning to her spine. We finish it. That night, the dynamic in the basement shifted completely. The tension of the day's near collapse hung in the dry air, but it wasn't frantic or desperate anymore. It was deeply, quietly focused. We were preparing the final, master dossier for the bank arbitration meeting. I was binding the heavy pages with an industrial stapler. 300 pages of irrefutable, audited proof. Wire transfer logs, IP addresses, forged depreciation schedules, and the hidden shell accounts. Gia was sitting across the table, meticulously compiling the index tabs. You risked your firm's neutral status today by escalating directly to the C-suite, she said quietly, not looking up from her paperwork. If Vance rejected the injunction, your partners would have fired you for overstepping the scope of the audit. I calculated the exposure against federal regulations, I replied, aligning the edges of the paper perfectly against the table. The risk of Vance ignoring a formal escalation was statistically negligible. She stopped sorting the tabs. She looked across the table at me, her eyes sharp and observant. Stop doing that. My hand paused, holding the stapler midair. Doing what? Hiding behind the math and the regulations, she said. Her voice was steady, holding a firm, unyielding boundary. You didn't file that escalation because of a calculated exposure, Rhodes. You did it because you cared what happened to Laura. You cared what happened to this store. You took a risk for us. I set the heavy stapler down on the plastic table. I looked at the cold metal surface. I didn't like analyzing my own motives. They were messy, unpredictable, human variables. They didn't fit neatly on a spreadsheet grid. But looking at her, sitting amidst the boxes of her life's work, I knew she was absolutely right. I deeply dislike bullies who use financial systems as weapons, I said, my voice quiet but absolute in the silent basement. It violates the integrity of the ledger. It violates the truth. Are you a PT? A personal tracker for everyone's tax problems? She asked, a small, wry smile finally touching the corners of her lips, bringing a sudden, intense warmth to her tired face. Or just mine? I looked up at her. I saw the sharp intelligence in her eyes, the incredible resilience that refused to break under immense pressure. I kept my hands resting flat on the table, maintaining absolute physical discipline. But I didn't look away. I gave a faint, rare smile. No. But for you? Anytime. I reached across the table and slid the finalized, bound dossier toward her. Memorize the sequence of the shell company transfers. Bo will inevitably try to interrupt you during the meeting to break your momentum and fluster you. When he does, you cite page 42, paragraph 3. You establish the precise timeline of the embezzlement. You do not let him speak over you. You hold the floor. She placed her hand flat on the heavy stack of paper, her posture straightening. I won't let him. The formal bank arbitration meeting took place on a Tuesday morning in a glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of the regional banking headquarters. The space was designed to intimidate, freezing and heavily chromed. I sat on the right side of the table, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and a muted gray tie. I was officially present as the neutral third-party auditor, my laptop closed in front of me. Gia sat next to me. She wore a sharp, tailored navy blazer, her posture impeccable and unyielding. She looked like a CEO walking onto a battlefield, completely prepared for war. Across the wide table sat Bo Cox. He was 50, wearing a bespoke suit that likely cost more than Gia's entire quarterly inventory budget. He radiated a smug, unearned confidence, leaning back aggressively in his leather executive chair. Next to him sat two senior bank executives, and at the head of the long table sat Elias Vance, the chief compliance officer, his expression unreadable. Let's make this exceptionally quick, Bo said, checking his heavy gold watch with an exaggerated, theatrical sigh. The bookstore is in massive default. The collateral metrics failed 3 weeks ago. I am fully prepared to assume operational control of the real estate today to satisfy the bank's exposure. Gia, you can hand over the keys and we can avoid a very messy, highly public foreclosure process. The lead bank executive nodded slowly, opening a thin folder. Miss Turner, according to the preliminary underwriting data, the business is completely insolvent. Gia didn't look at Bo. She looked directly at Elias Vance. She reached into her leather portfolio and pulled out the thick, meticulously bound dossier we had built in the basement. She slid it smoothly across the chrome table so it stopped exactly in front of the compliance officer. The business is highly solvent, gentlemen, Gia stated, her voice projecting a calm, lethal authority that easily filled the acoustics of the large room. The preliminary data was intentionally manipulated by Mr. Cox to force this exact meeting. Bo laughed, a harsh, loud, dismissive sound deliberately designed to belittle. I opened my copy of the dossier. I didn't look at Bo. I addressed the room with absolute, clinical detachment. Page 12. I instructed the executives. They instinctively reached for the pages, the sound of thick paper turning echoing loudly. You will find the secure IP logs from October 14th. The depreciation schedule for the physical assets was manually altered at 2:14 a.m. to reflect a 40% catastrophic loss. The terminal MAC address and IP routing originate directly from Mr. Cox's primary residential address. Bo stopped laughing instantly. He sat forward, his face darkening with sudden, aggressive fury. This is an internal partnership dispute. The auditor has absolutely no right. Page 42. Paragraph 3. Gia interrupted, her voice slicing cleanly through his objection, exactly as we had planned and practiced in the basement. She didn't raise her volume. She simply owned the acoustic space in the room with absolute, undeniable certainty. You will see a sequence of wire transfers originating from the bookstore's operational account, routed into an LLC registered in Delaware, a shell company wholly owned by Bo Cox. He has been systematically embezzling capital to create the cash flow shortage. The bank executives were staring at the documents, their faces pale. Elias Vance was reading the pages with rapid, laser focus. The room had gone dead silent. The truth was measurable, tangible, and sitting heavy on the table in front of them. These documents are verified by the independent, finalized audit, I stated, closing my folder with a definitive, echoing snap. The default is fraudulent. If the bank executes the foreclosure, you will be complicit in a federal wire fraud scheme. I have already drafted the formal report for the SEC. It will be filed at 5 p.m. today unless the asset freeze is permanently lifted and the mezzanine note is nullified. Bo stared at me, his jaw working furiously, his hands clenching into tight fists on the table. He realized instantly that he was completely trapped. He didn't have a spreadsheet error. He had a meticulously documented federal crime. Elias Vance closed the dossier. He looked at Bo with cold, professional disgust, then looked back to Gia. The freeze is permanently lifted, Miss Turner. We will be launching an immediate internal compliance review regarding Mr. Cox's advisory board status. He will not be participating in bank operations moving forward. Gia didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply nodded once. I expect the legal release documents signed and delivered to my store by noon. She stood up, gathered her leather portfolio, and walked out of the glass room without looking back at the wreckage she had left behind. I followed her, leaving the chaos of their ruined, fraudulent plan behind me on the chrome table. We rode the elevator down to the grand lobby in total silence. The descent was rapid, my ears popping slightly as we dropped 40 floors toward the street level. When the heavy steel doors opened, we walked out onto the rain-slicked pavement of the city. The coastal air hit my lungs, smelling strongly of exhaust, wet concrete, and salt. Gia stopped under the wide canvas awning of the bank building. She turned to face me. The heavy adrenaline of the confrontation was slowly fading from her posture, leaving behind a quiet, grounded exhaustion. But her eyes were incredibly bright. "He's gone," she said, her voice soft, as if testing the reality of the words against the noise of the busy street. "He will likely face a federal indictment by the third quarter," I confirmed, adjusting the grip on my leather briefcase. "The paperwork we submitted is permanent. Vance has to report it to shield the bank." She looked at me for a long time. The street traffic rushed by, a chaotic blur of gray sedans and red taillights splashing through deep puddles, but the small space between us under the awning felt completely insulated, ordered, and remarkably safe. "You didn't have to build that level of unassailable defense," she said softly. "You could have just submitted the basic, required audit and let the lawyers handle the fallout." For once, I didn't reach for my notebook. I just stood there, letting the cold rain mist against my face where it wanted, leaving my pen capped in my pocket. "Basic audits leave room for interpretation and manipulation," I replied, maintaining steady eye contact. "I don't leave room for interpretation when it comes to things I value." I reached into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled out a single, heavy sheet of watermarked legal paper. I handed it to her. Gia took it, unfolding it carefully. Her eyes scanned the dense legal text. It was a formal Articles of Incorporation document, officially stamped by the state registry. "I restructured the operational entity," I explained, keeping my voice level and incredibly precise. "Salt and Spine is now a completely independent LLC, wholly owned by you. The toxic debt structure tied to Bo is entirely severed. I have already filed the preliminary drafts with the state and copied Elias Vance in compliance so the bank recognizes the new entity immediately. But it requires a final, wet ink signature from a designated financial officer to finalize the permanent filing." Gia looked up from the paper, the rain misting lightly against her dark hair. "I don't have a financial officer?" "You do if you want one," I said. The words left my mouth before I could measure them. My throat tightened. I didn't correct myself. It wasn't a grand romantic speech. It wasn't poetry. It was a practical, concrete, legally binding offer of true partnership. I was offering to anchor her chaotic, passionate world with my order, permanently. Gia stared at the document. The weight of the moment settled quietly between us. Then, right there on the busy sidewalk, with businessmen rushing past under black umbrellas, she pulled a heavy silver pen from her portfolio. She didn't hesitate for a single second. She pressed the thick paper against the damp brick wall of the bank building and signed her name with a bold, aggressive, beautiful stroke on the bottom line. She folded the paper and handed it back to me, her fingers brushing the damp cuff of my jacket. "File it." Gia's phone vibrated in her blazer pocket. She pulled it out, her thumb swiping across the glass screen. A small, genuine exhale of relief parted her lips. "It's Laura," The payroll batch just cleared the secondary processing tier again. The staff is paid. I took the signed LLC document, feeling the exact physical weight of the paper, the precise reality of the wet ink. I carefully placed it back into my inner pocket, securing it safely over my chest. "I'll need unredacted access to the basement archives tomorrow morning," I said, a faint, genuine smile finally breaking my professional facade. "We need to completely reorganize the 2021 tax boxes. The current grid is unacceptable." Gia laughed, a bright, clear, wonderful sound that cut effortlessly through the gloom of the coastal rain. She stepped closer, closing the final distance, and stood beside me, our shoulders almost touching as we looked out at the moving city. "We'll buy you a better lamp," she promised quietly. I looked down at the leather portfolio resting against her hip. For the first time in my structured, methodical life, I noticed the flap of her bag was slightly crooked, the silver clasp misaligned. I didn't reach out to fix it. I just let it be. I learned that true integrity isn't just about refusing to lie. It's about doing the hard, precise work to protect the truth when others try to manipulate it. Real love isn't found in chaotic drama or grand speeches. It's built in the quiet consistency of someone who shows up, does the math, and helps you carry the weight when the numbers don't add up. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.